All right, YouTube, if you've been keeping up with the news, you're probably seeing right now in the last 24, 48 hours what some of us were monitoring for literally the last month or so, which is the Ukrainian riots, as they call them on Russia Today, or protests, as we call them here in the West. The sort of partisanship involved with the Ukrainian situation has warped the view of everyone, I think, outside of the Ukraine to one side or the other. The Russians and people in other parts of Eastern Europe, which are more like Russian friendly, they look at these opposition groups, they say, well, they're rioting. They're unruly mobs of people, they're violent and so forth. Whereas here in the West, in the EU, in the United States and so forth, people are increasingly seeing them as a legitimate opposition, the legitimate governing body of Ukraine in many ways, because Yanukovych now is seen as so utterly corrupt. I think what people need to keep in mind is that there are two sides to the story, and that we are not actually physically in the Ukraine, that we're relying on often misconstrued media reports for our information. And I think that goes both ways. Both the Western media and the Eastern media are skewing this story to their own partisan lines. But what we do know is that Yanukovych is increasingly getting apparently paranoid and violent. The police have been cracking down. The military now has cracked down. People are now dying. The hospitals in some of these affected areas now don't have any room left for people who do not have serious wounds, and they've actually set up hospitals now, makeshift hospitals in Orthodox churches, to take care of people's wounds if they're not seriously injured, because there's just too many people on both sides, police and protesters, who are being killed and injured now. The police, what's called the Berkut, I'm not sure what particular type of police they are. It sounds like some sort of strong-armed gang, from what I can gather. Some sort of militarized police force apparently torched the union building, the trade union building in Kiev, and or one of these other cities, and some people died there. They literally lit the building on fire while there were still people inside. The protesters have attacked and taken over at least one military base, and attacked other military groups as well. The people in Kiev Square, their fires are still going. They're still there. The police are still attacking them with tear gas and water cannons. They're still throwing bottles and beating on the police too. It's mainly a clusterfuck at the moment. What you see right now is an extended period of unrest in the world. You can look back as far as the Arab Spring, if you can call it that, and you can say sort of the eastern and western spheres of the world are getting into a more and more dangerous proxy war situation, which now, instead of taking the form of actual warfare between multiple countries, is internal struggle. On a very wide scale, we've got Syria right now, where Western-backed groups, as well as Islamic-backed groups, as well as Assad's Russian-backed forces, as well as other groups, are all fighting for dominance. We've got Venezuela right now, has millions of protesters out in the streets, because right now there is no food, toilet paper, all of these goods that people need to survive. They have run out. Due to the mismanagement of their own government, that their socialist, communist sort of government, their mismanagement of the economy, there's no food. People are beginning to starve. People are beginning to run out of items like soap and toilet paper that they need to live a comfortable lifestyle. People there are trying to overthrow their government. In the Ukraine, it's partially geographic, because the eastern side of the country, which is physically closer to Russia, gets a disproportionate amount of Russian trade. The western side gets a disproportionately high amount of European trade. The more industrialized side is pretty much European. The eastern side is more rural, less wealthy, and is more part of the Russian sphere. So these sides there's a difference between these two sides in their reaction to these protests. Although the government of the Ukraine, and now the government of Venezuela, and the government of Syria, and all of these other governments are making the same mistake, which, if they read history and they studied these things, they should know that this is the wrong thing to do. When protesters take to the streets in large numbers, and you send the police out to beat on people. What was once a less popular movement instantly gains higher popularity, to the point where now the majority of people in the Ukraine want Yanukovych out. It wasn't that way a few months ago. A majority of the people a few months ago still supported the reigning regime in the Ukraine. The same as in Venezuela. Now that people are being attacked, especially when people start seeing pictures of protesters with their eyeballs hanging out or their skulls fractured, blood streaming down their faces, especially if there are young, especially females in the protests, that really hits home on an emotional level to people. It really sways public opinion. You saw the same thing in the United States during the Civil Rights Movement. The civil rights movement became a lot more popular with the bridge and Bull Connor in Selma and all of these things. When they saw protesters being attacked by dogs, beaten down by police, the protesters had not attacked anyone. They hadn't thrown a bottle. They hadn't yelled a single insult, and they were suddenly attacked by police. They were considered innocent bystanders. They're just standing there, marching, protesting. They got attacked. Instantly, public support swung wildly in favor of the civil rights movement because of the images that were coming out, especially because by that time it was on TV. It wasn't just pictures in a newspaper. It really hits home more. Now we've got the internet. People are actually watching these protests live as they happen from multiple streams. Any time that the police corner and beat down a civilian or spray people with a water cannon or whatever else, people have an emotional response to that. There is now what was once a month or so ago, our media did not really report on the Ukrainian situation. You had to go to alternative media sources to hear anything about it. It wasn't on CNN. It wasn't on Fox. Only in the last few weeks have they taken up this story. And now only tonight is it front page news on any of these sites. Because it wasn't considered important. Now that these pictures and stories are coming out of the Ukraine, the West is solidly united behind the Ukrainian protesters. The government of the Ukraine has done the absolute worst thing that it could do in the last 24 hours by mobilizing the military and really trying to put the screws to these people. And it's not even working, by the way, in the Ukraine right now. They've taken over a military base. They've burned down at least one police headquarters and occupied a couple of others. They've jumped military convoys. They've taken military arms. They've disarmed actual soldiers and taken their weapons and body armor and so forth. They're coming out into the street in larger and larger numbers. It's the same thing that's happening in Venezuela. I saw a YouTube video last night in Venezuela, and they were marching. They had tanks rolling down the street firing on these protesters. What do you think that does to the psyche of people who see that footage, whether they're in Venezuela or the Ukraine or not? It swings people in the other direction. In Syria, it actually went the other way. To those of you who are rabid Putin fans, I know this virulent politics person that considers herself a political analyst will come out onto this video and say, well, you're just fooled by the West. You're getting, illegitimate media information and so forth. By the way, I'm not really following. I don't care about CNN's story. I'm going onto forums and onto these live streams to get my information. I don't trust our media any more than I trust Russia Today. I'm sure she's a regular viewer of Al Jazeera and Russia Today and all of these sites. That doesn't matter. People have got to realize that there's an emotional response here. And for those of you, again, who are like Putin fans, Syria went in the other direction. People over here now largely back Assad, who is backed by Russia, because we realized that the rebels were worse than he was. So don't worry about Syria. None of us really want it to fall at this point, especially with Al-Qaeda operating there. But Venezuela and Ukraine are both teetering on the edge of civil war right now. From a geopolitical standpoint, if Venezuela and Ukraine both fall into the Western sphere, their socialist, sort of Russia-friendly governments are removed from power and Western, more democratic governments are installed by these opposition groups, that really puts the screws to Russia. Because Russia gets a disproportionately large amount of agricultural goods from Ukraine. And Venezuela is loaded with oil. It might have the largest oil reserves on Earth. Just like North Korea got gifted with largest rare earth mineral reserves. Venezuela may have more oil than Alaska. Venezuela might have more oil than Saudi Arabia. The only thing holding it back from this development is it hasn't been explored. If it goes into the Western fold, it's going to get billions and billions of dollars of investment. Foreign firms will pour into this country and beg to explore for oil and pay 10 times what the Russians would pay to find this oil and this natural gas that's offshore in Venezuela. They would love to do that. It would mean oil right in the Americas. It wouldn't have to come from the Middle East. It'd be a lot cheaper to export back here, and as well as distribute in Venezuela. It would raise the quality of life and all that capitalist nonsense. If Venezuela and Ukraine are both removed, what allies does Russia have left? It has Iran, which it's basically hobbled because the Saudis are right next to them. The Israelis are there. The Israelis already have nuclear weapons. The Iranians really would be suicidal to do anything. There's Syria. Again, Syria is marginally powerful, but again, it's flanked by Turkey, which is far more powerful. The Turks are squarely in the Western sphere and could beat the living shit out of Assad in Syria overnight if they wanted to. Again, Saudi Arabia's right next door, Israel's right next door, Egypt is kind of on the fence as far as who it's allied with. North Korea, now the North Koreans hate the Russians. They also hate the Chinese. And the Russians hate the Chinese, and the Chinese hate the Russians, and these people only vote together on Security Council panels because they hate the United States more than they hate each other. In reality, though, the Chinese really don't care about Russia because Russia can't pay them as much for their goods as the United States, its largest trading partner. Who does Russia have left? Russia is an enormous country, which you would think logically it would make them really powerful and they'd have a huge booming economy, and it's not. The reason being that a lot of their country is functionally useless. The center of their country, there's not enough infrastructure, there's not enough money in the world to build the sort of infrastructure that you would need to actually export goods from the center of that country effectively. Especially when it was the Soviet Union, then it was even larger. Why do you think the Central Asian countries, other than Kazakhstan, are still in the Stone Age, essentially? There's no arable land. There are some mineral reserves. Kazakhstan has most of them. The Kazakhs took most of the mineral reserves. The Ukrainians took most of the grain fields. The people in Latvia and Estonia and so forth took a lot of their waterfront property on the Atlantic side. Russia really is in a tough situation if Ukraine and Venezuela both fall out of the Eastern sphere, which is exactly why these protests are going on. Yes, of course, agent provocateurs from the West sparked these protests. However, even if the Western world is involved with trying to manipulate people in these countries into joining the West, they would still be a lot more wealthy and well-off as part of the Western world. And the economic problems in Venezuela right now are not due to any sort of manipulation other than the manipulation of their own corrupt, inept government. The same as in Ukraine. These individuals are hoarding great deals of this money and keeping people artificially poor to drive down the cost of labor so they can export. This is done in third world countries all the time, but Ukraine is not, at least strictly speaking, a third world country. It's part of Europe. The western third of the country is extremely industrialized and relatively wealthy. Venezuela is not really a third world country. They're not living in mud huts. It could be a developed nation in the future. The only thing holding them back is they refuse to trade with the Western world largely. I think they were selling oil to New York a while back, and like Castro buys cows from my home state of Vermont, but largely these countries don't do trade with anyone. They attempt to be self-sufficient without the means to do so, while doing a little bit of trade here and there and paying lip service to Putin. Putin doesn't give a shit about the Venezuelans. He doesn't care about the Ukrainians. The reason he wants these countries is for his gain, which is why the United States keeps groups in its sphere, and China keeps groups. Why do you think China props up North Korea? Because they've got minerals. They can get those minerals more cheaply than extracting their own minerals. They can use their own minerals for their own infrastructure. They export the North Korean minerals because it's cheaper. They make more money that way. They charge the same price, but they don't have to pay the North Koreans as much as they'd have to pay their own people. Why do you think the Russians keep Ukraine? Because of the grain. They want food. If the Ukraine starts selling it all to the EU, Russia will starve. They don't have that much arable land of their own. They wouldn't be able to export any goods because they'd barely be self-sufficient. This is all geopolitical strategy right now. But to the people in Ukraine and Venezuela, they have legitimate issues with their own governments. Their governments are corrupt. Their governments are keeping them impoverished. Both of these nations are large enough, have enough arable land and enough natural resources, Ukraine's full of natural gas, by the way, to easily become industrialized first world nations. They have the ability to do it with foreign investment and partnerships and trade. They have the ability. They're being held back by the fact that they are sucking the cock of Putin, and the people have woken up to this and realized, why should we remain poor while our government takes all of our money and keeps us in the Stone Age? I'm not surprised that these people are protesting right now in large numbers. The majority of the population of both of these countries now supports the opposition, largely because of the brutality of the regimes that are currently holding power. It's simple strategy. I almost said strategery. I'm not trying to be George W. here. Kill me if I ever do that. But these countries have it in them to become quite wealthy, far more wealthy than they currently are. By the way, the Ukraine holds a nice little position at the stopgap between Russia and the EU. A lot of trade goes through the Ukraine too, and potentially could be a lot more if they industrialized more heavily, which they could easily do as a partner with the EU. Not saying the EU is perfect. They've got huge problems with immigrants, especially right now, and their growth of CCTV, censorship, sort of politically correct nonsense. The Swiss and Norwegians mainly are resisting this, which is good on them. They're also the most wealthy people in the EU. Ukraine has the ability to become as wealthy as Germany. Venezuela has the ability to be as wealthy as France. And if they enter the Western fold, it's only a matter of time before that happens, if investment is honest and fair, if it's looked after by people who actually care about these countries, both within and without their nations. So I wish these people well. Hopefully they hang their reigning governments. Or impale them on pikes, which is exactly what they deserve. And always remember, from a libertarian perspective, I wouldn't care if it was a Putin-backed movement. I'd still side with the people over their government when the government are acting like assholes. Just like I side squarely with Assad and his people, who are backed by Russia, over the rebel groups in Syria. Because clearly, he's looking out for the good of at least a minority of the population. The Islamists just want to destroy everything.